A single clue can change everything. I'm Miss Marple. Welcome to my new case.
The snow had begun to fall just as the church bells of St. Mary Mead chimed 6 o'clock on Christmas Eve, each flake catching the warm amber light that spilled from cottage windows and transforming the familiar village lanes into something from a Christmas card. Miss Jane Marple stood at her sitting-room window, watching the gentle accumulation on her garden gate, when she noticed Captain James Thornfield making his way down the high street with that particular military bearing that some men never quite abandon, even years after hanging up their uniforms. She had been observing the captain with quiet interest since his return to the village 3 weeks prior. At 32, he possessed the kind of weathered handsomeness that spoke of foreign service and difficult experiences, though he rarely discussed his years in Burma beyond the most general pleasantries. His aunt, Mrs. Millicent Thornfield, had been beside herself with joy at his homecoming, having raised him since his parents' death in a railway accident when he was 12. The village had welcomed him warmly, as they always did returning sons, though Miss Marple had noticed a certain reserve in his manner that suggested the years abroad had changed him in ways that went deeper than the silver threading his dark hair, or the lines around his eyes. The evening's festivities were centered at the village hall, where the annual Christmas Eve gathering brought together nearly every resident of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple had attended earlier, observing with her usual quiet attention the familiar social choreography that unfolded whenever the village assembled. She had watched young Dr. Pemberton's obvious admiration for Miss Sarah Hartwell, the new schoolmistress, and noted how Captain Thornfield's presence seemed to unsettle more than one established relationship. There had been something particularly interesting about the way Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, the widow who ran the village shop, had avoided the captain's eye, and how her daughter Margaret had colored deeply when he'd complimented her singing during the carols. Miss Marple had excused herself early, claiming a slight headache, but in truth she had felt the need for quiet reflection. There had been an undercurrent of tension at the gathering that she couldn't quite identify, though her years of observing human nature had taught her to trust such instincts. People, she had long ago learned, carried their secrets like carefully wrapped packages, and sometimes the most innocent occasions had a way of causing the string to come undone. From her window, she could see Captain Thornfield pause beneath the street lamp outside the Blackwood shop, checking his pocket watch with the same precision he applied to everything else. He glanced toward the village hall, where the sounds of continued celebration drifted through the snowy air, then walked on toward his aunt's cottage at the far end of Church Lane. Miss Marple noticed that he carried himself differently than he had earlier in the evening. There was a tension in his shoulders that suggested internal conflict, and his usual measured pace seemed somehow urgent. As she watched, a figure emerged from the shadows near the lich gate of the old churchyard. Even in the dim light and falling snow, Miss Marple recognized Margaret Blackwood's slight form and distinctive green coat. The young woman appeared to be waiting, and when Captain Thornfield approached, there was a brief, intense conversation that Miss Marple could not hear, but whose emotional content was unmistakable from the body language of both participants. Margaret seemed to be pleading about something, while the captain's posture suggested reluctance and perhaps regret. The conversation ended abruptly when Margaret turned and hurried back toward the village center, leaving Captain Thornfield standing alone beneath the ancient yew trees. He remained there for several minutes, a solitary figure in the falling snow, before continuing on his way. Miss Marple observed that he no longer moved with his characteristic military precision, but walked like a man carrying a burden too heavy for his shoulders. She was just considering whether to put the kettle on for tea when she heard voices raised in anger from the direction of Mrs. Thornfield's cottage. The words were indistinct through the snow and distance, but the tone was unmistakably heated. Miss Marple had known Millicent Thornfield for 20 years, and had never heard her raise her voice above a gentle murmur. The argument continued for several minutes before falling into an ominous silence that seemed to press against the peaceful Christmas Eve atmosphere like a discordant note in a familiar carol. When the cottage door opened again, Miss Marple expected to see Captain Thornfield emerge, perhaps to walk off his temper in the snow. Instead, she watched his aunt step out onto her front path, looking left and right with obvious agitation before hurrying toward the village hall with uncharacteristic haste. The cottage behind her remained lit, its windows glowing warmly, but there was no sign of movement within. Something, Miss Marple reflected as she reached for her shawl, was decidedly not as it should be on this most peaceful of nights. Miss Marple drew her shawl closer against the falling snow and stepped purposefully into the crystalline night. Her years of observing human nature had taught her that when people departed from their usual patterns of behavior, particularly with such obvious distress as Mrs. Thornfield had displayed, the wise course was gentle investigation rather than polite withdrawal. The snow crunched softly beneath her sensible boots as she made her way toward the Thornfield cottage, where warm lamplight still glowed from the windows despite the apparent absence of its occupants. She had progressed only halfway down Church Lane when she encountered Dr. Pemberton hurrying in the opposite direction, his medical bag clutched firmly and his usually composed demeanor showing clear signs of agitation. Upon seeing Miss Marple, he paused with evident relief, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. "Miss Marple, thank goodness," he said, adjusting his hastily donned coat. "Mrs. Thornfield has just arrived at the village hall in quite a state, insisting that her nephew has vanished under what she terms suspicious circumstances. I was heading to examine the cottage before we consider involving Constable Lake officially. You wouldn't happen to have observed anything unusual this evening, would you?" Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "I did notice Captain Thornfield entering the cottage perhaps 20 minutes ago, and there appeared to be a rather heated discussion shortly thereafter. Mrs. Thornfield seemed quite distressed when she left for the hall." She paused, considering her words carefully. "There was also a brief encounter between the captain and young Margaret Blackwood near the churchyard earlier this evening. The conversation appeared rather intense, though I couldn't discern the substance from my window." Dr. Pemberton's expression grew increasingly troubled as they continued toward the cottage together. "That aligns with what Mrs. Thornfield has told the gathering. She claims they argued about some matter from his military service, and that he declared he wouldn't be treated like a prisoner in his own home before storming out through the back garden. What concerns her most is that his bed hasn't been slept in for several nights, and she discovered he'd been secretly packing his belongings." The cottage, when they reached it, presented a picture of domestic tranquility that seemed to mock the growing concern. The front door stood slightly ajar despite the falling snow, and through the lighted windows, the interior appeared undisturbed. Yet Miss Marple detected an unsettling quality in the very stillness that emanated from within, as though the house itself held its breath. Inside, Mrs. Thornfield's meticulous housekeeping was evident in every carefully arranged detail, save for the captain's room, which showed obvious signs of hasty departure. His wardrobe gaped open with telling empty spaces, and his traveling case was conspicuously absent. On the small writing desk, a half-finished letter lay in his careful script, though Miss Marple refrained from examining it closely out of respect for privacy. What did catch her attention, however, was a faint but distinctly exotic scent lingering near the window. Sweet and dry, reminiscent of Eastern spices, or perhaps expensive cigarettes of a type rarely encountered in St. Mary Mead. The window itself remained securely latched from within, but the curtains showed signs of disturbance, and there were curious scuff marks on the wooden sill that suggested someone had gripped it firmly. Meanwhile, at the village hall, Mrs. Thornfield's dramatic entrance had transformed the festive Christmas Eve gathering into something resembling a town meeting. Her cry of "James has vanished" cut through the lingering strains of carols like a discordant note, causing conversations to halt mid-sentence and faces to turn toward her with expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed curiosity. The theories began immediately, each revealing as much about the speaker as about the missing captain. Mr. Ponsonby, ever ready to assume moral failings, suggested romantic entanglements, while his wife delivered a sharp elbow to discourage such speculation. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, her expression carefully composed, observed that the captain had always seemed restless since his return, as though St. Mary Mead could no longer contain whatever experiences had shaped him abroad. Most telling, however, was young Margaret Blackwood's reaction. The colour drained from her face so completely that Miss Sarah Hartwell, the schoolmistress, moved instinctively to steady her. When Margaret stammered that she hadn't seen the captain for days, her trembling hands and the way she avoided her mother's sharp gaze suggested a story quite different from her words. Dr. Pemberton, having returned from his examination of the cottage, confirmed the signs of departure but added his own disturbing observations about the scene. The exotic scent, the disturbed window area, and most puzzling of all, the footprints he'd discovered in the back garden, not the single trail one might expect from a man departing alone, but what appeared to be two sets of prints walking closely together toward the gate that led to the old mill path. As the village constable was summoned and search parties organized, Miss Marple positioned herself quietly near the tea table, watching and listening with the patient attention of someone who understood that in small communities, the truth often emerged not through dramatic revelations, but through the accumulation of small inconsistencies and telling silences. The evening's festive spirit had evaporated entirely, replaced by something far more complex and potentially dangerous than a simple domestic disagreement. Something had indeed happened to Captain Thornfield, but Miss Marple was beginning to suspect that his disappearance was neither as voluntary as some hoped, nor as innocent as others feared. Constable Lake arrived with the measured tread of a man accustomed to dealing with lost sheep and boundary disputes rather than mysterious disappearances, but his eyes held the sharp intelligence that had earned him respect throughout the county. The snow continued its gentle descent as he took statements with methodical care, his notebook growing damp from the flakes that found their way through the village hall's ancient windows. Mrs. Thornfield, seated rigidly beside the fire with her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles showed white against her black gloves, provided additional details that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of her nephew's final days in St. Mary Mead. Under the constable's patient questioning, she revealed that Captain Thornfield's agitation had not been confined to this single evening. For nearly a week, he had been restless and secretive, taking long walks at peculiar hours and receiving correspondence that he destroyed immediately upon reading. She had discovered ashes in the fireplace on several mornings, though the mild weather required no fires for warmth. Most troubling of all, he had spoken repeatedly of feeling imprisoned in his own home, watched and questioned like a suspect rather than a welcomed family member. The search parties that formed revealed as much about village dynamics as genuine concern for the missing man. Miss Marple observed with particular interest how Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood immediately volunteered to search the area around her shop, while her daughter Margaret remained conspicuously silent until her mother's pointed glance compelled reluctant participation. When Constable Lake questioned Mrs. Blackwood about her earlier encounter with the captain, her response came almost too quickly. She claimed neither she nor Margaret had seen him since he left the hall that evening, though Margaret's visible flinch suggested a different truth entirely. Dr. Pemberton returned from his examination of the cottage with news that transformed concern into genuine alarm. Following the footprints through the back garden and along the old mill path, the search party had discovered a leather traveling case half submerged in the reeds beside the brook. The initials J.T. were clearly stamped in brass, but the lock had been forced crudely, gouging the fine leather, and the contents scattered as though by desperate or careless hands. Inside, they found personal items, a folded shirt, photographs, and, most significantly, the brown envelope Mrs. Thornfield had mentioned, now opened and its papers damp and partially torn. What struck Miss Marple as particularly significant was not what the case contained, but what it lacked. No money remained, though Mrs. Thornfield confirmed her nephew had withdrawn a substantial sum from his account only days before. The case itself showed signs of having been deliberately abandoned rather than accidentally dropped, positioned where it would inevitably be discovered by searchers following the obvious trail. Miss Hartwell, the young schoolmistress, provided another piece of the puzzle when she revealed her observation of Captain Thornfield the previous evening, standing motionless in the churchyard for nearly an hour, staring at the gravestone of Private William Ashford. The young man had died in Burma during the same period when Captain Thornfield served there, and Miss Hartwell described the captain's expression as haunted beyond description. Dr. Pemberton, drawing upon his own brief military medical experience, recognized the signs of what modern medicine was beginning to understand as battle fatigue or nervous shock. Yet Miss Marple found herself studying faces rather than accepting the increasingly popular theory of psychological collapse. Margaret Blackwood's behavior throughout the crisis troubled her analytical mind. Rather than displaying natural concern for a man with whom she'd clearly shared some emotional connection, the young woman seemed primarily focused on avoiding questions about their earlier encounter. When pressed by Constable Lake about their conversation near the churchyard, she claimed they had merely exchanged Christmas greetings, though her trembling hands and flushed cheeks suggested far greater significance. Most revealing was Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood's reaction when Margaret finally approached her with obvious intent to confess something important. The older woman's swift intervention, her firm hand on her daughter's arm, and her insistence that there's nothing to tell, spoke of desperate control over a dangerous narrative. Miss Marple had observed such maternal protectiveness before, usually when a mother feared her child's words might lead to consequences more serious than mere embarrassment. The exotic scent that lingered in Captain Thornfield's room added another layer of mystery. Dr. Pemberton identified it as Turkish tobacco, or perhaps expensive Eastern cigarettes, certainly nothing available at Mrs. Blackwood's village shop. The scent suggested either a connection to the captain's past service or the recent presence of someone with distinctly foreign habits, someone who might have stood close enough to the window to leave ash on the sill while conducting urgent business. As the evening wore on and search parties returned empty-handed, the snow having obliterated any remaining tracks, Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe the subtle interplay of relationships under stress. Constable Lake, clearly overwhelmed by implications beyond his usual experience, announced his intention to contact regional authorities for assistance, but Miss Marple suspected the truth lay closer to home than any outside investigation might discover. The broken footbridge discovered near the mill provided a convenient explanation for tragic accident, but Miss Marple noted how quickly certain individuals embraced this possibility while others seemed relieved by any theory that diverted attention from more uncomfortable questions. In her extensive experience with human nature, she had learned that people rarely vanished into water or snow. They vanished into the expectations and fears of those around them, into bargains made and promises broken. As the village hall gradually emptied and St. Mary Mead settled into an uneasy Christmas morning, Miss Marple reflected that Captain James Thornfield's disappearance was neither as simple as romantic entanglement nor as straightforward as psychological collapse. Someone in their peaceful village knew considerably more than they were willing to admit, and the accumulating evidence suggested that the captain's fate had been decided not by his own tormented conscience, but by someone else's desperate action. The question now was not whether something had happened to Captain Thornfield, but whether his disappearance was the result of careful planning or a moment of panic that had spiraled beyond control. Christmas morning dawned with deceptive tranquility over St. Mary Mead, the fresh snow having transformed the village into a picture-perfect scene that seemed to mock the darkness of the previous night's events. Miss Marple, who had spent a restless night turning over the peculiarities of Captain Thornfield's disappearance, rose early and made her way through the crisp morning air to St. Mary's Church. She had learned through decades of careful observation that times of crisis revealed people's true natures more clearly than any ordinary occasion. And Christmas morning, with its demands for maintaining festive appearances, despite underlying tensions, often proved particularly illuminating. The congregation was notably diminished, with several key families conspicuously absent from their usual pews. Mrs. Thornfield's empty place was understandable given her distress, but Miss Marple noted with interest that the Blackwood family occupied their customary seats, despite having been central figures in the previous evening's drama. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood sat with her characteristic rigid posture, though her knuckles showed white where she gripped her prayer book, while her daughter Margaret appeared pale and distracted, her hands trembling so noticeably that she dropped her hymnal twice during the opening service. During the rector's sermon about divine mysteries and hidden truths, Miss Marple observed Margaret's behavior with growing concern. The young woman's eyes kept darting toward the memorial plaque dedicated to local men who had died in foreign service, particularly lingering on Private William Ashford's name. When the congregation rose for the final hymn, Margaret swayed so visibly that her mother's steadying hand became necessary, and Miss Marple noticed how the girl's gaze seemed to search the church as though expecting someone to appear. Following the service, Miss Marple positioned herself strategically near the ancient lich gate, offering Christmas greetings while carefully noting the subtle interactions between villagers. Dr. Pemberton approached with obvious relief at finding someone willing to discuss the situation frankly, informing her that regional authorities had been contacted and would arrive within hours to conduct a more thorough investigation. The broken footbridge near the mill had been examined more carefully in daylight, revealing damage that appeared recent but could not definitively be attributed to either natural deterioration or deliberate action. What concerned Dr. Pemberton most, however, was Mrs. Thornfield's deteriorating condition. He had visited her early that morning and found her alternating between desperate hope and dark mutterings about secrets that should have stayed buried in Burma. Most significantly, she had discovered something that cast doubt on the theory of voluntary departure. Captain Thornfield's mother's signet ring, which he never removed, lay on the tray beside his bed. In Dr. Pemberton's medical opinion, a man planning to disappear permanently would not leave behind such a deeply personal talisman. The morning's revelations took a more official turn with the arrival of Inspector Craddock from Scotland Yard, a methodical man whose reputation for handling complex cases had preceded him. Unlike the well-meaning but overwhelmed Constable Lake, Inspector Craddock immediately established that Captain Thornfield's disappearance bore hallmarks of careful planning rather than spontaneous action. The positioning of the abandoned traveling case, the selective removal of documents and money, and the deliberate obliteration of tracks suggested someone familiar with investigation procedures. Inspector Craddock's examination of the captain's room revealed details that local observers had overlooked. The exotic tobacco scent, when properly analyzed, proved consistent with a specific blend favored by former colonial officers and available only through certain London establishments. More troubling was chemical residue on the windowsill indicating recent burning of papers, suggesting that important documents had been destroyed at the scene rather than simply removed. The window itself, while securely latched from within, showed scuff marks on the sill that suggested someone had gripped it firmly, possibly while conducting urgent business. Margaret Blackwood's interview with Inspector Craddock took place in the village hall's small back room, with her mother maintaining a protective vigil that bordered on fierce defiance. Margaret's account of her encounter with Captain Thornfield remained frustratingly vague, insisting they had merely exchanged Christmas greetings despite the obvious emotional intensity witnesses had observed. When pressed about the captain's state of mind, she admitted he had seemed troubled about something from his past, but claimed ignorance of specific details. Miss Marple, who had positioned herself where she could observe without appearing intrusive, noted several telling details during this questioning. Margaret's distress seemed genuine rather than calculated, suggesting fear of revelation rather than guilt over actions. Mrs. Blackwood's interventions, while protective, carried an undertone of desperation that spoke to knowledge of dangerous secrets. Most significantly, when Inspector Craddock mentioned the exotic tobacco found in the captain's room, both women exchanged a swift glance that suggested recognition. The investigation's scope expanded when Tom Ashford, Private William Ashford's older brother, arrived to offer his cooperation. A large, fair man with a seaman's weathered hands and a recent scratch along one knuckle, Tom had been clearing fallen branches from the church path and confirmed speaking with Captain Thornfield the previous afternoon near his brother's grave. Their conversation, he admitted, had concerned William's death in Burma, with Tom asking directly what really happened at Kyoksei, and the captain responding that his brother had not suffered. Inspector Craddock's attention focused on Tom's boots, which bore distinctive hobnail patterns, but Miss Marple had already noted that the footprints Dr. Pemberton described were smooth-soled and included one set that was notably smaller and lighter. When Tom produced his tobacco, ordinary players' cigarettes with their acrid, salt-tinged aroma, it bore no resemblance to the sweet, dry spice that had lingered in the captain's room. As the official search expanded and villagers gathered in worried clusters, Miss Marple reflected on the accumulating evidence with growing unease. The investigation was proceeding along logical lines, but something in the careful orchestration of revelations troubled her analytical mind. Inspector Craddock, competent though he was, seemed increasingly focused on Margaret Blackwood as the most obvious suspect, while the exotic tobacco, the burned documents, and the precise positioning of evidence suggested a more sophisticated mind at work. The afternoon brought news that transformed concern into genuine alarm. A thorough search of the mill area had revealed not Captain Thornfield's body, but evidence that someone had deliberately staged the scene. The traveling case showed signs of having been carefully positioned rather than abandoned in haste, and the scattered contents appeared to have been selected to suggest robbery while concealing whatever the true searcher had actually sought. As Christmas Day wore on and the official investigation settled into established patterns, Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that Captain Thornfield's disappearance was neither romantic tragedy nor psychological collapse, but something far more calculated and dangerous. Someone in St. Mary Mead possessed both the knowledge and the ruthless determination necessary to orchestrate not just a disappearance, but the subsequent investigation's direction. The question was no longer what had happened to Captain Thornfield, but who among their peaceful village's residents was capable of such sophisticated deception, and what secret from the captain's past had been worth killing to protect. The truth, Miss Marple suspected, lay not in the obvious motives and convenient evidence that satisfied Inspector Craddock, but in the small inconsistencies and careful omissions that revealed themselves only to those who understood that in matters of murder, the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most helpful in solving the crime. Boxing Day arrived with the brittle brightness that follows snow, bringing with it the peculiar atmosphere of a village trying to maintain holiday normalcy while harboring dark secrets. Miss Marple rose early, understanding that the second day of Christmas often loosened tongues more effectively than official questioning, as people found themselves caught between festive obligations and the weight of unspoken knowledge. She wrapped a jar of her homemade plum conserve in brown paper and made her way through the crystalline morning air to call upon Mrs. Thornfield, employing the kind of neighborly pretext that had served her well in previous investigations. She found Millicent Thornfield maintaining a fragile composure that reminded Miss Marple of porcelain held together by will alone. The sitting room bore the unmistakable signs of a sleepless night. Cold tea on a silver tray, a volume of sermons lying face down and forgotten, the fireplace overpoked until the coals had turned to ash. Most significantly, Miss Marple observed without comment that 2 teacups sat upon the tray, one bearing the faintest trace of lipstick at its rim, while the other showed a brownish ring, more consistent with a man's hurried consumption than a lady's careful sipping. Under Miss Marple's gentle encouragement, Mrs. Thornfield revealed details that cast her nephew's final days in an increasingly troubling light. Captain Thornfield had indeed been deeply agitated, speaking repeatedly of London business that required putting something right and expressing frustration when his aunt suggested consulting their family solicitor. Most telling was Mrs. Thornfield's confession that she had salvaged a small, scorched fragment from the fireplace after her nephew's hasty destruction of correspondence. The remnant bore a printed heading that read Sutcliffe and Sons, Jermyn Street, with the notation, Turkish mixture, special, beneath. This discovery puzzled Mrs. Thornfield considerably, as her nephew had always despised smoking, having lost his father to a chest complaint. The exotic tobacco that had lingered in his room was therefore not his personal indulgence, but evidence of someone else's presence. The Jermyn Street address suggested connections to London's clubbable world of former colonial officers and military men, a detail that Miss Marple filed away with her characteristic precision. When questioned about the second teacup, Mrs. Thornfield admitted that Tom Ashford had called early that morning, ostensibly bringing holly for the Christmas decorations, but clearly seeking information about his brother William's death in Burma. Tom had appeared strained and watchful, repeatedly glancing toward the lane as though expecting unwelcome visitors, and had pressed Mrs. Thornfield about whether Captain Thornfield had ever written regarding the place called Kyoksy where William had died. Miss Marple's next destination was the village post office, where Miss Effie Cribbins presided with the sharp attention to detail that made her an invaluable source of information. Under the guise of purchasing stamps she didn't require, Miss Marple learned of a registered letter that had been collected on Christmas Eve, addressed to Captain Thornfield but signed for by someone claiming to be Margaret Blackwood. The signature, however, bore none of Margaret's characteristic flourishes, instead showing the careful, unpracticed hand of someone attempting deception. This revelation took on greater significance when Miss Marple encountered the Blackwood women outside the shop, noting Margaret's obvious distress and her mother's protective vigilance. When Margaret approached with clear intent to confess something important, her mother's swift intervention revealed the kind of desperate control that suggested dangerous secrets. Under Miss Marple's gentle questioning, Margaret finally revealed that Captain Thornfield had indeed asked her to post a letter after midnight on Christmas Eve, claiming it had to be sent at that specific time or it would go to the wrong place. When her mother had intervened, forbidding such improper behavior, the captain had appeared deeply ashamed and had withdrawn the letter without explanation. Returning to the Thornfield cottage for a more detailed examination, Miss Marple applied her formidable powers of observation to details that Inspector Craddock had dismissed as insignificant. The half-finished letter on Captain Thornfield's desk, while bearing his distinctive handwriting, was written on cheap, coarse paper rather than his usual heavy, cream-colored stationery with its embossed family crest. Such a deviation from established habits suggested either haste or circumstances beyond his control. More revealing were her observations of the window itself. While Inspector Craddock had noted that it remained latched from within, Miss Marple discovered tiny scratch marks on the painted wood of the latch mechanism, suggesting someone had attempted to force it from outside with a thin metal implement. The scuff marks on the sill, which others had attributed to the captain's own movements, showed the pattern of a gloved hand pressing downward for leverage while reaching inward, not the marks of someone leaning out. The exotic tobacco scent that permeated the room proved even more complex upon careful analysis. While similar to the Turkish blend mentioned in the Sutcliffe receipt, it carried an underlying sweetness reminiscent of burnt sugar or floral incense, suggesting the tobacco had been mixed with another substance or burned in proximity to something more fragrant. This subtle distinction spoke to Miss Marple's understanding that the nose, like the eye, could perceive truths that pure logic often missed. Meanwhile, Inspector Craddock's investigation proceeded along more conventional lines, focusing increasingly on Margaret Blackwood as the most obvious suspect. Her evasiveness, combined with the staged appearance of evidence at the mill and village gossip about her attachment to Captain Thornfield, created a compelling narrative that satisfied his preference for straightforward solutions. He dismissed the exotic tobacco as a personal indulgence from the captain's travels and attributed the disturbed window area to pre-departure agitation. Miss Marple, however, found herself troubled by the careful orchestration of evidence that seemed designed to support exactly such conclusions. The footprints Dr. Pemberton had described near the mill showed two sets walking side by side rather than one following the other, suggesting companions rather than pursuer and pursued. The lighter, more careful tread of the second set indicated deliberate movement rather than reluctant compliance. As the afternoon progressed and Inspector Craddock prepared to formally question Margaret Blackwood as his primary suspect, Miss Marple reflected on the accumulating inconsistencies that pointed toward a more sophisticated deception. Someone with intimate knowledge of village dynamics and investigative procedures had carefully constructed a narrative that would satisfy official inquiry while concealing the true nature of Captain Thornfield's fate. The exotic tobacco, the forged signature, the staged evidence at the mill, and the manipulation of Margaret's obvious emotional connection to the captain all suggested a mind capable of complex planning and ruthless execution. Most troubling was the realization that such intimate knowledge of village life and relationships could only belong to someone who had lived among them for years, someone trusted and respected, someone who understood exactly how suspicion would fall and how to ensure it fell in the wrong direction. Miss Marple found herself convinced that Captain Thornfield's disappearance was neither romantic tragedy nor psychological collapse, but cold-blooded murder committed by someone who had recognized the threat he represented to their carefully constructed life. The question now was not who among the obvious suspects had acted in passion or desperation, but who among St. Mary Mead's most respectable residents possessed both the knowledge and the ruthless determination necessary to orchestrate not just a murder, but the subsequent investigation's misdirection. As Boxing Day drew to a close and Inspector Craddock prepared to make his arrest, Miss Marple settled into her evening chair with the quiet determination of someone who understood that in matters of murder, the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most helpful in solving the crime. The truth lay not in the convenient evidence that satisfied official inquiry, but in the small inconsistencies and careful omissions that revealed themselves only to those who understood that evil, like virtue, often wore the most respectable of masks. The evening of Boxing Day settled over St. Mary Mead with the peculiar heaviness that follows revelation, as Inspector Craddock prepared to formalize his case against Margaret Blackwood. The village hall had become an impromptu headquarters, with statements spread across the rector's writing desk and Constable Lake maintaining a careful log of witness testimony. Miss Marple, observing from her strategic position near the tea service, noted with growing concern how neatly the evidence seemed to align against the young woman, as though someone had carefully arranged each piece to support exactly such a conclusion. The inspector's confidence received its first significant challenge when Miss Effie Cribbins arrived with additional details about the registered letter collected on Christmas Eve. Under more thorough questioning, the postmistress revealed specifics that cast the entire incident in a different light. The woman who had signed Margaret Blackwood's name possessed certain distinctive characteristics: expensive kid gloves with a small tear at the right forefinger, a dark coat with the hem let down twice, and most significantly, the lingering scent of foreign tobacco mixed with something sweetly floral. She spoke with authority, Inspector, Miss Effie explained, her sharp eyes bright with the importance of her testimony. Said, "My daughter cannot be troubled on Christmas Eve, in that firm way some have, when they expect to be obeyed without question." And her lipstick was a deeper crimson than most ladies wear in winter, quite striking against her complexion. This description immediately drew Miss Marple's attention to Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, who had maintained a protective vigil over her daughter throughout the day's proceedings. When Inspector Craddock turned his questioning toward the shop proprietress, Her composed demeanor showed the first signs of strain. She admitted with careful precision that she had indeed collected the letter to spare Margaret any impropriety, claiming Captain Thornfield had been indiscreet in requesting such an errand at an inappropriate hour. "I returned it to him directly," Mrs. Blackwood stated, her hands folded with deliberate calm. "I advised him to let old matters rest undisturbed. He was not grateful for my counsel." Miss Marple's keen observation noted several telling details during this exchange. Mrs. Blackwood's gloves showed the exact tear Miss Effie had described, and when she moved her hand to adjust her coat, the faint but unmistakable scent of exotic tobacco became apparent. Most significantly, a silver cigarette case bearing the initials E.B. lay partially concealed beneath a copy of The Lady on the side table, with a folded tobacconist's card from Jermyn Street visible beneath its edge. The investigation took another unexpected turn with Tom Ashford's arrival, his weathered face showing clear signs of internal struggle. His confession, delivered with the blunt honesty of a man pushed beyond endurance, revealed both his confrontation with Captain Thornfield and the complex emotions surrounding his brother's death in Burma. Tom admitted to striking the captain once during their heated exchange near the mill, but insisted he had left him alive and unharmed. "I went home to Mother," Tom declared, showing the fresh scratch on his knuckle. "She'd lit candles for the late service. That's God's truth, and she'll swear to it." Dr. Pemberton's examination of the recovered documents from the mill provided crucial context for the captain's agitation during his final days. The waterlogged papers revealed not only the official reports of William Ashford's heroic death, but also more recent correspondence suggesting someone had discovered discrepancies in the military records. The exotic tobacco found in Captain Thornfield's room was not evidence of his personal habits, but proof of a visitor who smoked expensive Turkish blends available only through specialized London establishments. Most disturbing was the revelation that the blackmail demands had escalated beyond mere financial payment to something far more personal and threatening. The correspondence indicated intimate knowledge of Captain Thornfield's current circumstances and emotional vulnerabilities, suggesting the blackmailer possessed detailed information about village life and relationships that could only come from someone with local connections. Miss Marple, synthesizing these revelations with her own observations, began to perceive a pattern far more sophisticated than Inspector Craddock's theory of romantic tragedy. The careful orchestration of evidence, the manipulation of Margaret's obvious feelings for the captain, and the precise timing of revelations all suggested a mind capable of complex deception and utterly ruthless in its execution. When Margaret finally broke down under questioning, her tearful admission that Captain Thornfield had asked her to post a letter at midnight on Christmas Eve provided another crucial piece of the puzzle. Her mother's swift intervention to prevent this improper behavior had forced the captain to seek alternative means of communication, leading directly to the confrontation that preceded his disappearance. As the evening progressed and Inspector Craddock prepared to expand his investigation beyond the village's borders, Miss Marple reflected on the accumulating inconsistencies that pointed toward a far more dangerous truth. Someone in St. Mary Mead had recognized exactly what threat Captain Thornfield represented and had acted with decisive brutality to eliminate not just one problem, but multiple complications simultaneously. The exotic tobacco, the forged signature, the staged evidence at the mill, and the careful manipulation of local relationships all suggested that Captain Thornfield's disappearance was neither accident nor crime of passion, but cold-blooded murder committed by someone who understood that the best way to conceal one killing was to make it appear to be something else entirely. The question was no longer who among the obvious suspects had acted in desperation, but who among St. Mary Mead's most respectable residents possessed both the knowledge and the ruthless determination necessary to orchestrate such sophisticated deception. Miss Marple settled into her evening contemplation with the quiet certainty that the truth lay not in the convenient evidence that satisfied official inquiry, but in the small betrayals and careful omissions that revealed themselves only to those who understood that evil, like virtue, often wore the most respectable of masks. The morning following Boxing Day brought an unexpected development that seemed to resolve all concerns while simultaneously deepening Miss Marple's unease. A telegram arrived at Mrs. Thornfield's cottage just as the village was settling into post-holiday routine, its message brief and reassuring. Safe in London, settling private affairs, do not worry, will write soon, J.T. The relief that spread through St. Mary Mead was almost palpable, with Inspector Craddock expressing satisfaction that his instincts about voluntary departure had proven correct. Miss Marple, however, found herself troubled by details that others dismissed as insignificant. Captain Thornfield's correspondence, which she had observed during her visits to his aunt, always bore his full signature and formal courtesy. The telegram's brusque tone and abbreviated signature seemed entirely inconsistent with his established character. More disturbing was Mrs. Thornfield's reaction. While relieved, she appeared puzzled by the message's impersonal nature, mentioning that James had never addressed her so curtly, even during his most troubled periods. A visit to the post office provided illuminating details about the telegram's origin. Miss Effie Cribbins, consulted with appropriate discretion, revealed that the message had been filed from Much Benham Station early that morning by a woman whose description matched exactly the figure who had collected the registered letter on Christmas Eve. The same dark coat with its twice-altered hem, the torn glove at the right forefinger, and most significantly, the commanding manner and exotic tobacco scent that had impressed the telegraph clerk. When Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood outside her shop, the woman's demeanor showed a marked change from the previous day's strain. Her composure had returned with interest, and she spoke confidently about Captain Thornfield's wisdom in seeking London's anonymity to resolve his troubles. Yet Miss Marple noted how Mrs. Blackwood's gloves bore that distinctive tear, and how the sweet, spiced aroma that clung to her clothing had become more pronounced, as though she had been handling the exotic tobacco more frequently. The afternoon brought a development that shattered any remaining confidence in the telegram's authenticity. Tom Ashford was discovered unconscious near the old mill bridge, blood matting his fair hair and his pockets turned inside out. Dr. Pemberton's examination revealed a glancing blow that had fortunately missed causing fatal damage. But Tom's condition prevented immediate questioning about his attacker or the circumstances of the assault. More significant than the attack itself was what remained at the scene. Constable Lake discovered a small card partially hidden beneath fallen leaves. Another Sutcliffe & Sons tobacconist receipt, this one bearing a more recent date and the notation, Turkish mixture, special blend, delivered to E. Blackwood. The card's placement seemed almost deliberate, as though dropped during hasty departure rather than accidentally lost. When Tom regained consciousness briefly, his mumbled words proved both revealing and disturbing. He spoke of meeting someone by the bridge who had asked about the ledger from Kyoksé and had seemed particularly interested in what Captain Thornfield might have told him about his brother William's death. The encounter had begun cordially but had turned threatening when Tom mentioned that the captain had promised to write everything down for the proper authorities. Inspector Craddock's investigation into the telegram's authenticity revealed troubling inconsistencies. No railway clerk at Much Benham remembered a passenger matching Captain Thornfield's description, and inquiries at London hotels of the type he would have chosen yielded no registrations under his name. The telegram itself, when examined more carefully, bore signs of having been composed by someone unfamiliar with the captain's usual manner of expression. Mrs. Blackwood's explanation for the tobacconist receipt, that she occasionally purchased specialty items for discerning customers, rang hollow when Sutcliffe & Sons confirmed by telephone that the order had been placed personally and paid for in cash by someone claiming to be the recipient. The timing of these purchases, coinciding exactly with the period of Captain Thornfield's greatest agitation, suggested a connection far more sinister than mere commercial accommodation. As evening approached and Tom Ashford's condition stabilized enough for proper questioning, Miss Marple reflected on the accumulating evidence with growing certainty. The telegram, the attack, the conveniently dropped evidence, and the careful manipulation of local sympathies all pointed to a mind capable of sophisticated deception. Someone in St. Mary Mead had recognized exactly what threat Captain Thornfield represented and had acted with decisive calculation to eliminate not just the immediate danger, but also to misdirect any subsequent investigation. The exotic tobacco, the forged communications, and the systematic removal of witnesses suggested that Captain Thornfield's fate had been sealed not by passion or desperation, but by cold-blooded planning, executed by someone who understood that the most effective way to commit murder was to make it appear that no murder had occurred at all. Miss Marple settled into her evening contemplation with the quiet certainty that the truth lay not in the convenient explanations that satisfied official inquiry, but in the careful orchestration of events that revealed themselves only to those who understood that in matters of life and death, the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most helpful in providing solutions. The question was no longer whether Captain Thornfield had met with foul play, but how long his killer could maintain the elaborate deception before the weight of accumulated lies brought the entire, carefully constructed edifice crashing down. The morning after Tom Ashford's attack brought Miss Marple to a crystalline understanding of the pattern that had been forming in her mind since Christmas Eve. She had spent the night reviewing every detail of Captain Thornfield's disappearance, and the accumulated evidence pointed not to passionate crime or desperate circumstance, but to methodical planning executed by someone with intimate knowledge of village life and investigative procedures. The time had come to test her theory through careful psychological observation, employing the kind of gentle confrontation that had served her well in previous encounters with dangerous minds. Her opportunity came unexpectedly when young Margaret Blackwood appeared at her cottage door just after breakfast, her face pale with exhaustion and her hands trembling as she clutched a small, oilskin-wrapped package against her chest. The girl's obvious distress and furtive glances toward the lane suggested both urgent purpose and mortal fear of discovery. "Miss Marple," Margaret whispered, stepping quickly into the sitting room when invited. "I should have brought this sooner, but I was frightened. Mother would never forgive me if she knew." With shaking fingers, she unwrapped the package to reveal a small leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with neat military handwriting that bore Captain Thornfield's distinctive style. Miss Marple examined the ledger with growing fascination as Margaret explained how Captain Thornfield had pressed it into her hands during their brief encounter at the Lich Gate on Christmas Eve. The entries were unmistakably from his Burma service, documenting not heroic military actions, but a systematic pattern of corruption that had cost lives and enriched those willing to exploit wartime chaos. Most significantly, the initials EB appeared repeatedly beside substantial monetary amounts, with notations suggesting payments for silence regarding questionable deaths and diverted supplies. "He said it proved that some men had used the war to fill their pockets," Margaret explained, her voice barely above a whisper, "and that when soldiers like William Ashford discovered the truth, they were silenced permanently. He feared someone here knew he possessed this evidence, and he was right to be afraid." Miss Marple studied the ledger's implications with the careful attention she applied to all matters of life and death. The document represented not merely evidence of past corruption, but a direct threat to someone who had built a respectable life on foundations of wartime profiteering and murder. Captain Thornfield's possession of such evidence explained both his agitation and his ultimate fate, while the initials EB provided confirmation of suspicions that had been growing in Miss Marple's analytical mind. After securing Margaret's promise to maintain absolute silence about the ledger's existence, Miss Marple made her preparations with the methodical care of someone who understood that confronting a killer required both courage and cunning. She wrapped her old recipe book in the ledger's oilskin covering, creating a convincing decoy while concealing the real evidence in a hiding place that had served her well in previous investigations. Then, with the quiet determination that had characterized her approach to human nature's darker mysteries, she set out to arrange a psychological test that would force the truth into the open. Her encounter with Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood outside the village shop was conducted with the gentle manner that had disarmed countless suspects over the years. The conversation began with neighborly concerns about Tom Ashford's condition and Captain Thornfield's mysterious departure, but Miss Marple's keen observation noted several telling details that confirmed her growing certainty about recent events. Mrs. Blackwood's hands, despite the morning's domestic tasks, bore the faint but unmistakable aroma of exotic tobacco, and her fingertips showed the slight yellowing that came from frequent handling of expensive cigarettes. When Miss Marple mentioned the possibility that Captain Thornfield might have left behind documents that would eventually surface to clarify his departure, Mrs. Blackwood's composed expression showed its first genuine crack. Such an expensive blend he favored, Miss Marple observed with innocent directness. Turkish tobacco, I believe, from that establishment in Jermyn Street. Quite distinctive and so aromatic. I couldn't help noticing the same scent in his room after his departure. The effect of these words was subtle but unmistakable. Mrs. Blackwood's hands stilled their busy arrangement of the newspaper display, and when she looked at Miss Marple, her eyes held a sharpness that revealed the calculating intelligence behind her mask of respectable concern. Her explanation about ordering specialty items for discerning customers rang hollow, particularly when delivered with the careful precision of someone walking a very narrow line between confession and concealment. I've always found that secrets have a way of revealing themselves, Miss Marple continued gently, particularly when they involve matters of life and death. Captain Thornfield seemed quite troubled by something from his military service. Documents, perhaps, or ledgers that recorded more than routine military business. Mrs. Blackwood's reaction to this seemingly innocent comment provided the final confirmation Miss Marple required. The woman's composed facade cracked visibly, her hand moving instinctively toward the silver cigarette case in her coat pocket before forcing itself to stillness. When she spoke of respecting privacy and avoiding speculation, her voice carried a warning that was all the more effective for its gentle delivery. As their conversation concluded, Miss Marple noted with satisfaction that Mrs. Blackwood's eyes had repeatedly darted toward the cottage where the supposed ledger lay hidden. The psychological test had succeeded beyond her expectations, revealing not only guilt but desperate determination to eliminate the evidence that threatened her carefully constructed life. That evening, Miss Marple positioned herself in the darkened kitchen with the patient attention of someone who understood that desperate people often made careless mistakes. Near 9 o'clock, she heard the soft click of her back gate, followed by careful footsteps that moved with the practiced quiet of someone accustomed to clandestine activities. The faint aroma of exotic tobacco, mixed with something sweetly floral, drifted through the darkness as gloved hands searched her sitting room with methodical efficiency. When the intruder departed with the false ledger, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of grim satisfaction. The psychological test had been completed successfully, confirming not only Mrs. Blackwood's guilt, but her willingness to commit further crimes to protect her secrets. The woman who had built a respectable life on foundations of wartime profiteering and murder had revealed her true nature through her desperate attempt to steal what she believed was evidence of her past crimes. As Miss Marple prepared to contact Inspector Craddock with the real evidence, she reflected on the sophisticated deception that had nearly succeeded in concealing Captain Thornfield's murder. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood was not a woman who had acted in sudden passion, but someone who had recognized a threat to her carefully maintained facade and had responded with the same methodical ruthlessness that had characterized her wartime activities. The question now was not whether she was guilty, but how to ensure that justice was served for both Captain Thornfield's murder and the earlier crimes that had made it necessary. The time had come for the final revelation that would expose not only a killer, but the dark secrets that had transformed a peaceful English village into the setting for calculated murder. Miss Marple settled into her evening contemplation with the quiet certainty that truth, like murder, would eventually find its way to the surface, regardless of how carefully it had been buried beneath layers of respectability and deception. The morning following the midnight burglary brought Miss Marple to a state of quiet satisfaction, knowing that her psychological trap had succeeded beyond expectations. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood had revealed her desperation by stealing what she believed was the incriminating ledger, confirming not only her guilt, but her willingness to commit further crimes to protect her carefully constructed facade. The time had come for the gentle confrontation that would force the truth into the open through the kind of psychological pressure that Miss Marple had perfected over decades of observing human nature under stress. Inspector Craddock arrived at her cottage within the hour of her telephone call, his expression showing the wary attention of a man who had learned to trust Miss Marple's instincts, even when they contradicted official conclusions. She received him with tea and her usual quiet courtesy, while explaining how the previous evening's events had confirmed her growing certainty about Captain Thornfield's fate and his killer's identity. "The person who searched my cottage moved with practiced efficiency," Miss Marple observed, pouring tea with steady hands. "Someone accustomed to clandestine activities and familiar with the kind of systematic search that leaves no obvious traces. Most significantly, Inspector, they took only the oilskin-wrapped bundle, ignoring far more valuable items that any ordinary thief would have found irresistible." She had prepared her strategy with characteristic thoroughness, understanding that Mrs. Blackwood's desperation would make her vulnerable to the kind of psychological pressure that revealed truth more effectively than any formal interrogation. A small tea party, she suggested, would provide the perfect setting for the gentle confrontation that would expose not only guilt, but the sophisticated deception that had nearly succeeded in concealing multiple murders. The gathering assembled in Miss Marple's sitting room with the punctuality that village courtesy demanded. Mrs. Thornfield appeared fragile but dignified, her composure maintained through habit and prayer. Margaret Blackwood entered pale and anxious, her eyes immediately seeking the Welsh dresser where she feared to see evidence of her secret. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood arrived with her usual composed authority, though Miss Marple noted the careful way she positioned herself to observe all exits and the faint but unmistakable aroma of exotic tobacco that clung to her dark coat. Miss Marple presided over cups and conversation with her characteristic gentle manner, speaking first of Tom Ashford's improving condition before allowing the discussion to drift, as if accidentally, toward the matter of documentation and record-keeping. Her seemingly innocent observations about household ledgers and the convenience of using initials to save space created the kind of subtle tension that revealed more than direct questioning ever could. "I confess I've always found comfort in proper records," Miss Marple remarked, placing the oilskin-wrapped decoy upon the table with deliberate casualness. "One writes down what one puts in, and one can see what comes out. The most useful ledgers rely on that simple principle of accurate notation." The effect was immediate and telling. Margaret flinched visibly at the sight of the bundle, while Mrs. Thornfield looked uncertainly between the women. Mrs. Blackwood's reaction, however, provided the confirmation Miss Marple required. A momentary stillness followed by the kind of controlled attention that spoke to desperate interest in the package's contents. "It is curious how initials can be so revealing," Miss Marple continued, opening the false ledger to display her recipe notations. "E.B. for elderberry, for instance. Of course, anyone familiar with the original ingredients would recognize the difference immediately." Turkish tobacco, for example, has such a distinctive aroma, quite unlike ordinary blends, and so persistent that one could identify it blindfolded. Mrs. Blackwood's response came with the smoothness of practiced deception, but Miss Marple detected the underlying tension that betrayed guilty knowledge. "I've always detested the smell of Turkish blends," she stated with careful precision, her denial revealing exactly the intimate familiarity she sought to conceal. The psychological pressure continued through seemingly innocent conversation about wartime experiences and the difficulty of letting old matters rest undisturbed. Miss Marple watched with growing certainty as Mrs. Blackwood's composed facade showed its first genuine cracks, her hands moving instinctively toward the silver cigarette case in her coat pocket before forcing themselves to stillness. When the tea concluded and her guests departed with conventional pleasantries, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of grim satisfaction. The psychological test had succeeded completely, revealing not only Mrs. Blackwood's guilt, but her desperate determination to eliminate any evidence that threatened her respectable existence. The woman who had built her life on foundations of wartime corruption and murder had exposed her true nature through her reaction to carefully orchestrated pressure. That evening, Miss Marple made her final preparations with the methodical care of someone who understood that confronting a killer required both courage and cunning. Inspector Craddock positioned himself at Dr. Pemberton's surgery, where the supposed photographic documentation of Captain Thornfield's papers would provide irresistible bait for someone desperate to destroy evidence of past crimes. As darkness settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the sophisticated deception that had nearly succeeded in concealing not just murder, but a pattern of killing that stretched back to wartime Burma. The final confrontation would reveal whether Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood possessed the nerve to attempt one last desperate gamble, or whether the accumulated weight of psychological pressure would finally force her carefully maintained mask to slip completely. The trap was set, and Miss Marple waited with the patient certainty of someone who understood that truth, like murder, would eventually find its way to the surface. The trap at Dr. Pemberton's surgery closed with the quiet precision that Miss Marple had anticipated, as Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood made her desperate final gambit in the small hours following their afternoon tea. The exotic tobacco scent that had marked every scene of deception now betrayed her presence as she moved through the darkened surgery with the practiced stealth of someone long accustomed to clandestine activities. Inspector Craddock, positioned behind the medical screen, watched her systematic search with growing certainty that their patient's psychological pressure had finally forced the killer into the open. When the lamp blazed suddenly to life, Mrs. Blackwood turned with the controlled composure that had served her for over a decade. But Miss Marple noted the telltale tremor in her gloved hands, and the way her eyes immediately assessed escape routes with calculating precision. The woman who had built a respectable existence on foundations of wartime murder stood revealed not as a pillar of village society, but as someone whose survival had always depended on eliminating inconvenient witnesses. "Mrs. Blackwood," Miss Marple said gently, settling into the chair beside Dr. Pemberton's desk with her knitting bag. "I believe the time has come to discuss your rather specialized knowledge of Turkish tobacco and why Captain Thornfield's room carried that distinctive aroma, despite his well-known aversion to smoking." The psychological revelation that followed demonstrated Miss Marple's characteristic method of gentle but inexorable exposure. She began with the seemingly insignificant details that others had dismissed: the torn glove that had signed Margaret's name at the post office, the lipstick trace on Mrs. Thornfield's second teacup, the scratch marks on the cottage window that suggested forced entry rather than voluntary departure. Each piece of evidence, when properly understood, painted a picture not of romantic tragedy or psychological collapse, but of methodical murder executed by someone with intimate knowledge of both village life and investigative procedures. "The exotic tobacco was your signature, you see," Miss Marple continued, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had exposed countless criminals. available only through Sutcliffe & Sons in Jermyn Street, and so distinctive that anyone familiar with ordinary blends would recognize its sweet, spiced aroma immediately. You smoked it while conducting your Christmas Eve business with Captain Thornfield, never considering that such an expensive habit would mark every scene where you manipulated evidence or eliminated threats to your carefully constructed respectability. Mrs. Blackwood's facade finally cracked completely when Miss Marple revealed the full scope of her wartime activities, documented in Captain Thornfield's ledger with the damning initials EB beside substantial sums extracted through corruption that had cost soldiers' lives, the systematic theft of medical supplies, the murder of Private William Ashford when he discovered the truth, and the subsequent elimination of anyone who threatened to expose these crimes, had all been conducted with the same methodical ruthlessness that characterized her approach to Captain Thornfield's inconvenient conscience. The final revelation came when Margaret Blackwood appeared at the surgery door, her face pale with exhaustion, but determined with the courage her mother had never anticipated. In her trembling hands, she carried the key to her mother's shop cellar, where Constable Lake's search had just discovered Captain Thornfield's body, concealed beneath coal sacks, his head bearing the fatal wound that proved death had come not from drowning but from deliberate violence. "I couldn't let him lie there any longer," Margaret whispered, her words carrying both grief and the terrible relief of finally speaking truth after days of enforced silence. "Mother, I'm sorry, but he deserved better than being hidden like something shameful." Mrs. Blackwood's response revealed the calculating mind that had orchestrated not just murder, but the subsequent investigation's misdirection. Her confession, delivered with chilling matter-of-factness, detailed how she had lured Captain Thornfield to his aunt's cottage on Christmas Eve under pretense of returning his intercepted letter, then struck him down when he refused her demands for the ledger's destruction. The elaborate staging of his disappearance, complete with false trails to the mill and fraudulent telegrams from London, had been designed to satisfy official inquiry while concealing the brutal reality of cold-blooded execution. As Inspector Craddock placed Mrs. Blackwood under arrest, Miss Marple reflected on the sophisticated deception that had nearly succeeded in transforming murder into mystery. The woman who had sold tea and sympathy to her neighbors for over a decade had built her peaceful existence through systematic elimination of inconvenient witnesses, maintaining her respectable facade until Captain Thornfield's return threatened to expose the wartime crimes that had funded her comfortable village life. The exotic tobacco that had seemed merely an expensive indulgence had proven to be the thread that, when properly pulled, unraveled an entire tapestry of corruption and murder stretching from Burma's jungles to St. Mary Mead's deceptive tranquility. Captain James Thornfield had died not for love or money, but because his conscience had finally compelled him to confront a killer who had learned that the most effective way to commit murder was to make it appear that no murder had occurred at all. As the surgery door closed behind the departing figures and silence settled over the village once more, Miss Marple gathered her knitting with the quiet satisfaction of someone who understood that truth, like virtue, would eventually surface despite the most careful attempts to bury it beneath layers of respectability and deception. The morning after Eleanor Blackwood's arrest dawned clear and still over St. Mary Mead, the village settling into that peculiar quiet that follows the resolution of terrible uncertainty. Miss Marple received Inspector Craddock in her sitting room with her usual gentle courtesy, the tea service arranged with care and her knitting basket close at hand. The time had come for the complete revelation that would satisfy both official requirements and the deeper human need to understand how evil had flourished so long beneath respectability's careful mask. "The exotic tobacco was the key that unlocked everything, Inspector," Miss Marple began, her needles clicking with their familiar rhythm. Mrs. Blackwood's expensive Turkish blend, available only through Sutcliffe & Sons in Jermyn Street, marked every scene where she manipulated evidence or eliminated threats. She never considered that such a distinctive habit would become her signature, lingering in Captain Thornfield's room after their fatal Christmas Eve encounter and betraying her presence at each carefully staged deception. Miss Marple explained how the seemingly insignificant details had formed a pattern visible only to those who understood that murder, like virtue, revealed itself through the accumulation of small betrayals. The torn glove that had signed Margaret's name at the post office, the lipstick trace on Mrs. Thornfield's second teacup, the scratch marks on the cottage window suggesting forced entry rather than voluntary departure. Each piece of evidence, when properly understood, painted a picture not of romantic tragedy, but of methodical elimination conducted by someone with intimate knowledge of village life and investigative procedures. Captain Thornfield possessed a ledger documenting wartime corruption in Burma, she continued, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had exposed countless criminals. The initials EB appeared repeatedly beside substantial sums extracted through theft of medical supplies and the systematic silencing of witnesses, including Private William Ashford. Mrs. Blackwood had built her respectable village existence on foundations of murder and profiteering, maintaining her facade until the captain's return threatened to expose crimes she believed safely buried in foreign soil. The Christmas Eve confrontation had unfolded with tragic inevitability when Captain Thornfield refused Eleanor Blackwood's demands for the ledger's destruction. Her response revealed the same calculating ruthlessness that had characterized her wartime activities, a precise blow designed to silence him permanently, followed by the elaborate staging of his disappearance. The abandoned traveling case at the mill, positioned where searchers would inevitably discover it, had been carefully arranged to suggest robbery or desperate flight, while concealing the brutal reality of cold-blooded execution. The telegram from Much Benham, filed by the same gloved hand that had collected his correspondence, attempted to provide the careless young man's briskness that Captain Thornfield would never have employed in addressing his beloved aunt, Miss Marple observed. Such attention to detail in some matters, combined with carelessness in others, often betrays those who believe themselves too clever for detection. Inspector Craddock listened with the respectful attention of someone who had learned to trust Miss Marple's insights, taking careful notes as she detailed how Tom Ashford's attack had been another desperate attempt to eliminate a potential witness. The exotic tobacco receipt found at the scene had been deliberately dropped, another breadcrumb designed to misdirect investigation, while Mrs. Blackwood continued her systematic removal of threats to her carefully constructed respectability. As the weeks passed and St. Mary Mead slowly resumed its familiar rhythms, the village bore the invisible scars that such revelations inevitably leave upon small communities. Mrs. Thornfield found a measure of peace in finally knowing her nephew's fate, though the betrayal by someone she had trusted cut deep wounds that time would be slow to heal. Margaret Blackwood departed for London to stay with distant relatives, her pale face showing the strain of someone who had discovered that the person she trusted most was capable of systematic murder. The village shop reopened under new management, though many residents felt uncomfortable entering premises that had concealed such dark secrets. Tom Ashford's recovery progressed satisfactorily, his gratitude to Miss Marple expressed through the practical gifts that working men offered, repairs to her garden gate, fresh vegetables from his allotment, and the protective attention that came from understanding how close he had come to joining his brother among Eleanor Blackwood's casualties. Dr. Pemberton confided his professional amazement at the sophisticated deception that had nearly succeeded in concealing not just murder, but an entire pattern of killing stretching back to wartime Burma. The methodical precision with which Mrs. Blackwood had orchestrated both crimes and their subsequent investigation demonstrated a mind capable of complex planning and utterly ruthless in its execution. As winter deepened and the village settled into its established patterns, Miss Marple reflected on the lesson that Eleanor Blackwood's crimes provided about the danger of assuming that respectability guaranteed virtue. The woman who had dispensed tea and sympathy to her neighbors for over a decade had maintained her peaceful existence through the systematic elimination of inconvenient witnesses, her facade cracking only when Captain Thornfield's conscience compelled him to confront a killer who had learned that the most effective murders were those that appeared to be something else entirely. Miss Marple set aside her knitting as evening settled over St. Mary Mead, satisfied that truth had prevailed despite the most sophisticated attempts to bury it beneath layers of careful deception. In her extensive experience with human nature's darker mysteries, she had learned that evil, no matter how cleverly disguised, eventually betrayed itself through the small inconsistencies that revealed themselves to those patient enough to observe and wise enough to understand that in matters of murder, the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most helpful in solving the crime. The soldier who had vanished on Christmas Eve had finally found his rest, and justice, though delayed by elaborate deception, had ultimately prevailed through the gentle persistence of truth over even the most respectable masks that evil chose to wear.